and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Spring 2023 Teaching Comprehensive History Instruction webinar series. I am Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education. This is the seventh topic in a series that the department is offering associated with the comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. This series is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints while highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation. Today, we are fortunate to have an exceptional presenter, Dr. Seena Skelton, back again to round out our learning on the disability rights movement, national and Michigan views. We welcome Dr. Skelton back for her second installment of this topic and eagerly await today's presentation. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history to our children. This broad effort will help us learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and our world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We're grateful for our presenter today, and we truly thank her for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth and knowledge and understanding of this topic amongst our educators. I'd also like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team, including our ASL interpreter, Candace B., for its continued efforts in identifying and selecting key topics and for arranging and organizing this virtual space for us to gather and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you for all your intentionality, interest, and courage in support of our students, which we refer to as our professional true north, and the preparation for their comprehensive understanding of our country and its history. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Scott Koenig, our MDE Social Studies Consultant in the Office of Educational Supports, to usher us forward into today's session. Scott?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, and good afternoon, and thanks all for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a Social Studies Consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of this event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide links to resources using the chat feature throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. If you would like sketches for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the view button at the top right of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps to inform future webinars. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace Barrier. Now, without further delay, please welcome Dr. Seena Skelton.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, and thank you to the Teaching Comprehensive History team. I'm so excited to be back with you all for part 2 of my webinar series, Journey from Disability Rights to Disability Justice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And get our presentation up and going. I am so excited to be back. Those of you who were able to join us for the first installment may recall that I am a fellow Michigander, although I am situated currently at Indianapolis. I am the director of the Midwestern Plains Equity Assistance Center, which is situated in Indiana University School of Education at IUPUI. I've lived in Indiana and worked at the Equity Center for a little over 10 years now. And prior to that, worked at an Equity Center in Arizona, situated at Arizona State University. And prior to that in Ohio. But although I've traveled and have engaged in conversations around equity across the United States, Michigan remains my home. And anytime I have a chance to have these really important and critical conversations with my fellow Michiganders, I am totally up for that. So very excited to be back. This is part 2, as I stated before, of a series discussing really the journey of how people with disabilities were treated and the fight for the rights of people with disabilities, moving from fighting for our rights to really towards disability justice. And I want to start off by just pointing out some of the images that are on my cover slide here. I think it's really important that we take a look at sort of the images and the stories the images can tell us about our history and therefore about our present and our future. Up in the left corner, what you see is a poster, an image of the protest, the student protest at Gallaudet University, which is a private university for the deaf and hard of hearing. And back in 1988, the students of Gallaudet engaged in a protest, fighting for the right for representation. This protest happened in March 1988, and it started when the Board of Trustees announced the decision to appoint a hearing candidate as the president of the university, overlooking 2 highly skilled deaf candidates. The students of Gallaudet wanted representation, and they wanted representation now. They have been put off year after year with the promise of a deaf president. And when that appointment came, the students said, no more putting off. We want a deaf president, and we want a deaf president now. And this really demonstrated the identity, the focus, the agency, the growth of the disability rights movement, moving from the right to exist and be treated with humanity to the right of representation. The bottom left corner image there, you see a picture of Brad Lomax and Judy Heumann. As I shared with you all at the last webinar series, Judy Heumann is known as the mother of the disability rights movement, an activist from the time she started her career in education to very recent, always advocating and fighting for the rights of people with disabilities. Beside her is Brad Lomax. Brad Lomax was a civil rights leader and a disability rights activist. And he brought together these 2 movements. It really illustrated the intersectional aspect of the disability justice movement today. The image in the top center column is Elisa Thompson. Elisa Thompson is a current disability rights activist. She is the leader of the National Disability Rights Network, which is a network focused on the protection and advocacy for people with disabilities, of people with disabilities. And she's the creator of Ramp Your Voice. And she discusses matters at the intersection of disability and race. Underneath Elisa Thompson is Alice Wong. Alice Wong is a disabled activist, writer, editor, media marketer, and consultant. She is also the founder and director of Disability Visibility Project. Alice Wong also is a leader in the disability justice movement, again, focusing on the intersection of disability justice and racial and ethnic justice. And the last image you see below Alice Wong is Leroy Moore. Leroy Moore is one of the founders of Sins Invalid and Crip Hop Nation. Sins Invalid is a disability justice-based performance project that focuses, again, on the intersection of disability and other marginalized identities through art, music, expression, and advocacy. So this is what the disability justice movement looks like today. Again, I'm Seena Skelton. My hometown is Detroit, Michigan, a proud Detroiter. I matriculated through Detroit Public School System as a student with a disability, supported in special education services, and supported through IEPs. I received my undergraduate degree from Central Michigan University, and then went on to graduate school at the University of Cincinnati, receiving my doctorate in school psychology. So I have experience working with educators, general educators, special educators, and working together to ensure that we're creating learning environments that are supportive, responsive, and inclusive of all children, with a particular emphasis on students with disabilities. My personal experience is really being a person who's been a part of the special education community on both sides of the table. I am a student, I was a student through special education, and then a practitioner. I identify as a Black woman with a disability, as well as a Black disabled woman. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on in our presentation today between the difference of identity first language and person first language. This topic is very near and dear to my heart, and I have strived for over 40 years of my life in advocacy of all people, with particular emphasis on the inclusion of people with disabilities at the intersection of other marginalized identities. This is a quote by Mia Meekness, who is also one of the forerunners and architects of the current disability justice movement. And Mia writes, "Disabled people are part of every community, and it is impossible and harmful to separate disability from our fight for liberation. The fight for freedom, the fight for our rights, for people with disabilities, is intricately integrated and connected to the fight for the liberation of all people." So let's take a quick review with some of the hard-won fights for people with disabilities to be treated with humanity, to be treated as equals, to be able to gain employment, and to be educated. You may recall from my first presentation that prior to the 1900s, people with disabilities were treated with isolation, stigmatization, and exclusion. People were often institutionalized, either as adults as well as children. People with disability had a hard time finding employment, and then often were unable to find employment except in circuses or what were called freak shows. They were out of sight and out of mind. This began to shift, however, in the early 1900s, particularly as a result of the First World War, when soldiers began to return from the war with disabilities. At that time, the federal government instituted several different programs to encourage and support the employment of these disabled soldiers. There were many programs and campaigns to begin to shift people's attitudes towards hiring people with disabilities. This, however, did not change people's attitudes towards people with disabilities. There was still a perception that disability was something to be cured Disability was something that to be stigmatized, and anything that we could do to prevent disability from continuing was something that was a focus of many advocates of the eugenics movement. So much so that there was a push to sterilize women who were disabled to prevent them from, quote unquote, passing down their defective genes. Learning from and using the right towards racial justice or for racial integration, the civil rights movement learned a lot from this. The disability rights movement learned a lot from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement really laid the groundwork and provided the blueprint for people with disabilities to fight for their own rights. Starting in the 1950s, people like Ed Roberts, who attempted to enroll in Berkeley University in California and was denied because of his disability, sued and took to the streets to protest. Ultimately, he was enrolled in the university, but could not live in the dormitory because they were not accessible. Ed Roberts, along with Judy Heumann and others, began the movement referred to as the independent living movement, which at its foreground fought for the understanding that people with disabilities can live independent and full lives. It was not their disability that was stopping them, it was society's reaction to their disability. This groundwork, this movement towards shifting the idea of people with disabilities to be treated as equal promoted a realization and an awareness, a consciousness, if you will. So people with disability began to develop what is now referred to as a disability consciousness. And through that consciousness, more people with disabilities rallied together and began to advocate for their own rights, for their own inclusion, for their own integration in schools, in the job market, in the community, in society. And these three levers were the prominent levers that really instigated and provided momentum to the disability rights movement: advocacy, activism, and legal action. Some of the prominent legal actions that shifted by law, shifted through legislation, the treatment of people with disabilities. And this information I shared at the end of our last time together, but I wanted to spend some time today to really focus in on these very pivotal legal actions. The first is, of course, Brown versus Board of Education. And although that particular lawsuit and the landmark Supreme Court decision was about racial integration, what the disability rights movement leaders learned from that was that the idea of separate is not equal. Separate is not equal as it pertains to racial segregation. Separate is not equal as it pertains to the segregation of people with disabilities. So the advocates of disability rights movement really took the heart of that decision and used that to really propel their work and their message towards disability rights. The next legal action that had brought about pivotal change in the rights for people with disabilities is Wyatt versus Stigney of 1970. This court ruled that people with intellectual disabilities have a constitutional right to education in the least restrictive environment. This further brought movement and momentum due to the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities, particularly people with intellectual disabilities. Judy Heumann in 1970, who again is known as the mother of the disabilities rights movement, began really her focus on ensuring that educators with disabilities have rights as well. Judy Heumann sued the New York Board of Education for discrimination. She sued for access. The New York City School Board had denied her a teaching license because they believed she could not be a teacher and also be a person with a disability. So she fought and she won her case. This also supported other disability movements around the country. Armstead versus LC and EW in 1999 improved the lives of many people with disabilities, as it stated that it was unjustified to segregate people with disabilities, and that the segregation of people with disabilities was discrimination and violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Let's talk a little bit about the path to what's known today as FAPE. So many of you probably are aware of that acronym and how we've turned that acronym into really a word, and that's FAPE. Free and appropriate public education for children with disabilities. Every child in this country has a right to a public education, and every child in this country has a right to a public education that is appropriate for them. But for generations and generations, children with disabilities were denied that right. There's a specific pathway between how students with disabilities were educated or not educated in the 1900s to what we know of as special education today, of which I myself was able to benefit. Again, starting back in that landmark case of Brown versus Board in 1954, which put in question the whole logic of segregation. In 1966, the amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided funds for public education funds for students with disabilities. So even though at that time, it was not the law of the land that students with disabilities were required to be educated, many states began to change their state laws to include the education of students with disabilities, although federal funds were not provided to support these children. In 1966, however, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided those funds. Two pivotal court cases in the early 1970s, 1971, the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children, also known as PARC, versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the Mills versus the District of Columbia were two cases that challenged the constitutionality of denying specific groups of children access to free and appropriate public education, and also focused on not only students with physical disabilities, but the inclusion of students with mental and emotional disabilities as well. Continuing on to 1973, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which guaranteed civil rights to disabled people and required accommodations for disabled students in schools. Together, the Mills Act and the Park Act, along with Section 504 of the 73 Rehabilitation Act, really formed then the foundational bricks for the Education of All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, which is the federal law 94-142, which required and made the education of children with disabilities the law of the land. So no more could states decide whether or not they were going to educate their children with disabilities. At this point, when this law became law of the land, every state across the country had to provide free and appropriate public education for their children within their state with disabilities. 1982, the court ruling of Board of Education in Hendricks case. This stated that students who qualify for special education programs must be provided individualized instruction to meet their specific needs. So this is where you begin to see the language of individual educational programming, or what we know of today as IEPs. 1997 was the reauthorization of the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. In 1997, that reauthorization changed the name of that law to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Continuing on to our path for free and appropriate public education for children with disabilities, 1990, another pivotal year for the right for Americans with disabilities. And that was the year that the ADA was enacted. The American Disabilities Act prohibited and prohibits today the discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, both at the state and local government level, as well at the federal level, prevents discrimination in public accommodations, including any publicly funded agency, organization, institution, or business, in commercial facilities, transportation, telecommunication, and also the United States Congress. In 1997, those amendments became really reinforced in IDEA. We jumped to 2004 with No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Education Act. And in 2004, the requirement included that all students, regardless of their disability or not having a disability, were required to engage in statewide assessments and be provided highly qualified, specially trained professionals to teach children, and specifically teaching children with disabilities. While No Child Left Behind had some controversial provisions, what was really significant about that piece of legislation for students with disabilities is that it required the students the district take count of their students with disabilities, include their students with disabilities in statewide assessments, and to use their data around who was being successful in their special education program as a part of their district evaluation process. In 2015, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized again. The name changed again as well, from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds. So take this time to reflect on the information that I shared thus far, how far we've come from the before the 1900s, where students with disabilities were excluded, isolated, institutionalized, where people with disabilities cannot find employment except in very degrading circumstances, to where we are now, where there's federal law and legislation requirements to educate all children, including children with disabilities, as well as anti-discrimination laws for adults with disabilities. Hard fought and hard won by people with disabilities advocating for themselves, engaging in legal action, and supporting various legislative acts, the enactment of various legislative acts. So take a few minutes, take about 1 minute, and reflect on the information shared thus far. What does this mean for your practice? What does this mean for your own additional learning? Okay, now let's bring us forward. Where are we now, right? Where do we begin to see the shift, not only in terms of how people with disability were treated, right? The treatment of people with disabilities, and the perspective of non-disabled people about people with disabilities, to shifting in views of the concept of disability in and of itself, and the really emergence of a disability consciousness and a disability identity. So there have been various models of disability throughout the years, throughout the generations. And these models really inform how we view disability, how we define disability, and then our actions as a result of our perspective of what is a disability, what makes a disability. Prior to the 1900s, really from the pre-1800s up until the 1920s to mid-1900s, there was a particular model of disability that is referred to in the literature as the Morrow model. And that is that it was a belief, there was a understanding or belief that if you had a disability, a person had a disability because they were being punished for something, right? Because they in a past life didn't do something right, or they would be being punished for something that their father or their grandfather or someone and their ancestors did, that they were being punished by God, really, that they were disabled because there was something wrong with their spirit, their morality. And this led to the people with disabilities being treated as if they were punished people, right? This led to a shame. This led to people with disabilities being stigmatized, being shunned, being ridiculed. And this sort of prevailing attitude contributed to the way in which people with disabilities were treated in terms of isolation, in terms of being institutionalized, in terms of the negative attitudes and discrimination that people with disabilities were faced. And that sort of model of disability really lasted throughout the 1800s and began to really, though, shift in the mid 1800s and 1900s to what became known as the medical model of disability. So as society become a little bit more enlightened, as science really took hold of sort of the common people's understanding about how the world works, then you see this emerging of the medical model of disability. And that is that the medical model of disability is that really hangs on the premises that there is something there's a normal body, there's a normal way of being, there's a normal psychological stance, way of understanding the world, the way of interpreting and processing information, the way of interpreting and processing one's emotions. There's a normal body, there's a normal way of being physically. And if you are divergent from that normality, that normalcy, then something is wrong. And the focus is then diagnosing of what is wrong with you, and then identifying what is wrong for the purpose of either curing you or providing some type of treatment so that you can approximate normal as much as possible. And if that was not successful, then you were to be segregated in an environment, a clinical environment that was specifically designed for your particular diagnosed ailment, right? So this notion of diagnosis, treatment, and or segregation. And that really laid the groundwork for how we even addressed education for students with disabilities, right? So students with disabilities and the way we educated students with disabilities is through almost a medical model type of ideology that we test and we diagnose students who may be different from some conception of what normal is, and then we provide some type of intervention or treatment. And if that doesn't work, then we segregate in special schools or separate classrooms, but we segregate from the typical, quote unquote, typical or normal student or child. And that sort of model of disability has really grabbed hold in education and really stayed really the viewpoint of disability for many years, for many centuries, the way we thought about disability. And therefore, people with disabilities were treated as such. It was treated as if they had a problem to be cured and to be fixed. This began to shift, though, in the 1970s as people with disabilities began to fight for their own rights and begin to fight for the right to define themselves. And when people with disabilities started coming together, started talking with each other, started organizing with each other, and started advocating for their own rights, what began to take shape was a different model of disability. What began to take shape was this model, this what's called a social model or minority model of disability. And what this model really contends is that people's bodies and minds are different. It is not the disability that's problematic, it's how society treats disability that is problematic. And so people with disability began to use as an analogy other minority, quote unquote, minority groups or minoritized groups. Just as people with people of color, when it's not that the problem is that people's race is the problem, it's how race is treated, right? It's how people of color, it's how society chooses to view different people of different races. It's how policies are enacted. It's how structures are put in place and barriers. And the fight is really the fight for equal rights. And so people with disabilities taking the lead from the fight for racial justice, for rights around racial integration, really use that as a model for their own, defining their own fight and defining how they look at themselves. And so people with disabilities began to say, the problem is not my disability, the problem is how society views my disability. And that became really a prevailing model of defining disability starting in the 1970s. And you begin to see actions towards that. You begin to see, just like you have ethnic studies programs starting in colleges and universities, and women's studies program start in colleges and universities. You begin to see the development of disability studies programs and universities as well, looking at and talking with and studying the histories, the practices, the culture of disability, right? The culture of disability, and promoting a particular type of a disability awareness. And this sort of model of disability has really taken hold, it's really supported by leaders of the disability rights movement up into really the 1990s, where they began to even take pushing that perspective on disability even more and begin to question this whole idea of normal, that there is a such thing as normal, that there is a such thing as the normal body or the normal way of thinking or the normal way of processing information or the normal way of expression. And what people with disabilities began to question and began to push the idea is that humans vary, that people are different, that people have different, people's bodies are shaped differently, people have different ways of navigating their world, people have different ways of expressing themselves, people have different ways of processing information, different ways that their minds and brains work, and that this idea that there's a normal way of being and therefore an abnormal way of being would be really beginning to be questioned quite a bit. And instead, this awareness or this argument that what we have is a variation among humans and that we run along a spectrum. And so rather than this sort of false dichotomy of disability and non-disability or disabled and non-disabled, was that we are all different. And at any time, any one difference can be more salient than another. And at any time, someone can become different in their own embodiment because of injury or sickness or illness. And that the way of addressing difference or human variation is through designing our world with a universal lens. How do we begin to design our buildings, design our structures, design our curriculum in a way that will allow and enable everyone to access, everyone to participate with the idea that we have difference across the human experience. And you begin to see the practice and principles of universal design in architecture. And one of the most salient sort of examples of universal design and architect is the curb cut. And so we know that we have now in many of our streets in our cities and towns where the separation from the curb or sidewalk from the street is through these curb cuts, or the lowering or evening of the curve and the street level to in almost a ramp, naturally made or configured ramp that's part of the design itself rather than an add-on. This is to accommodate for people who may not be able to step up high on a curb, whether they have a disability or not, a so-called disability or not. Maybe they're just at an age where stepping up may be difficult, or someone who's using a wheelchair and is unable to, the wheelchair is unable to climb up a curb, but can go up a slant in the curb that will allow a person in a wheelchair, or a person who's using a cane or a walker, or a parent who may be pushing a stroller. And so this idea that we can design our world to address all the different variations that may be demonstrated in the human experience. This evolution of the way in which we define, the way in which we think about disability really began to reflect how people with disabilities were seeing themselves and beginning to define themselves. And disability consciousness began to really take shape, and a disability identity began to emerge. A disability identity refers to people with disabilities having a positive sense of self about and the feelings and connecting to not only their own disability, but also the disability community at large. And so what does it mean now to have a disability if you are a person with a disability? What does it mean to have a disability identity? And for me, I can share with you all, personally for me, this disability identity was something that sort of evolved in my own life. So as a younger child, as a young adult, as a high schooler, as a young adult in my 20s and 30s, disability was something that I had. I was born with a disability. I was born with various different physical differences. I'm a person of short stature. I am a above the knee amputee. I have fairly significant scoliosis, and so I'm shaped a little differently. I navigate my world a little differently. And for me, from the time I was very young, I thought of disability as something that I had. I had these differences. And so as such, it was something that I had to sort of deal with and had to sort of overcome, right? But then I began to shift. As I grew older, as I became more comfortable in my own skin, as I matured, as I engaged in more reading, and as I learned more about the history of people with disabilities, as I learned about the disability rights movement, as I learned about people like Judy Heumann and Brad Lomax, that people with disability did great things too. The people with disabilities fought for their own rights. The people with disabilities were not just people were non-disabled people did things for, but that we fought and did things for ourselves. There's agency within the disability community. I began to take on a different identity and a different relationship to my own disability. And this is where disability identity emerges from, as I learned more about my own community. Now I consider disability as part of who I am. So it is part of my identity. And just like being Black is part of my identity, just like being a woman is part of my identity, having a disability is part of my identity as well. So I refer to myself as a Black disabled woman. I may sometimes refer to myself as a person with disability, but often I refer to myself as a disabled person. And just to sort of draw an analogy, when I identify my racialized identity, I don't say I'm a woman with Blackness. I say I'm a Black woman. And so as following that same logic, I don't necessarily say I'm a woman with a disability. I say I'm a disabled woman. It's a part of my collective identity. It's a part of what makes me me. I would not be Seena if I did not have all aspects of my identities, including my disability. And this is where disability identity refers to one's relationship with oneself and one's relationship and connection to the disability community. And that comes through understanding one's own history, understanding one's own place in society and the contributions to our society and what we are able to benefit from today. Disability identity really takes its shape and begin to really, you begin to see this throughout our history, again, coming from the 1970s, but more strongly in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. So what you see here are a couple of images that really underscore and reinforce the concept of disability identity. The left bottom corner, you see an illustration of people, diverse people with different types of disabilities, with the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." This was a mantra that was used by disability rights activists in the 1980s. And it really means that no decision about people with disabilities should be made without people with disabilities. And this was a pushback against decisions being made for people with disabilities by non-disabled people. This was a pushback of non-disabled people speaking for people with disabilities, speaking for disabled people, making decisions for disabled people and people with disabilities without having representation. This is a illustration of this disability pride, the disability identity, the importance of representation. The middle image you see at the top of the individual crawling on the curb there on the stairs, that image is an image from the Capitol Crawl, what became known as the Capitol Crawl. The Capitol Crawl was a protest that occurred in the 1990s. And it was in months before the ADA was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. And it was to protest the delay in the signing and enactment of the ADA. And people with disabilities who were wheelchair users or people with disabilities who have physical disabilities or other types of disabilities literally crawled up the stairs of the Capitol to protest the inaccessibility of the Capitol and accessibility of other public venues. Again, you can see the agency there of people with disabilities fighting for their own rights and fighting for more than rights, but fighting for justice, fighting for fairness. And then again, the image over to the right, again, is an image of the 1988 protest at Gallaudet University, deaf president now. Again, a reflection of the importance of identity and the importance of representation. People with disabilities wanted to and want to represent themselves, and identity is important. So again, this leads us to then the discussion around people first versus identity first language. Early, and as I've shared in this presentation and before, the fight for people with disabilities was just to be seen and perceived and understood as human, to be treated with dignity, to be treated as a person. And the focus is on appreciating people with disabilities' personhood. And so there was a movement called the Person First Movement, Person First Movement, to use people first language or person first language. That is, I'm a person, and recognize me as a person, and recognize my the disability second to the person. And that was a movement that pushed back against the stigmatization and the sort of shame, the attitude that was being sort of directed towards people with disabilities, that they were not even treated as people. And so the focus was on treat me as a person, identify me, understand me as a person first. And that's important. And that was an important fight to engage in. That brings us to where we are today. And that continues to be important. But also, as I've shared, that there was this recently in the past, since the 80s and 90s and 2000s, particularly in the 2000s, there's been a shift from perceiving disability as something to sort of overcome to understanding disability as part of the human existence, as part of human variation, and people are different. And for some differences manifest in various different ways, right? And that having a disability is more than something that a person has, it's a part of their identity. So many people with disabilities perceive their identity as being, their disability as being a part of their identity, as I shared before. So some people who are deaf or hard of hearing do not consider their deafness as a disabling condition, but consider their deafness as part of who they are. There's a deaf culture, there's a pride, there's a sense of deaf being a part of who they are. Their deafness is being a part of who they are. People who have neurodivergence, who identify as being artistic, that is something that's part of who they are. Many people consider that as part of their identity. And so this really ushered in a different way of referring to oneself, from person first to identity first. That identity is part of who I am. So I may say that I am a disabled person because my disability is a part of my identity. And so that's the difference really between person first language and identity first language. They both are valid. They both come out of a movement. They both are important for non-disabled people to understand, right? And so what I would suggest that if you are a person without a disability, that you continue to use person first language, unless someone shared with you, I'm okay with being using identity first language. Please refer to me, refer to my disability in identity first language. Unless you're given sort of permission by a person with a disability to use identity first language, it's always a safe call to use person first language. However, if you are a non-disabled person, you should not police how people with disabilities really refer to themselves. So a person with a disability refer to themselves by their identity, using identity first language, refer to themselves by their disability. Then if you're non-disabled, then you don't have the right to police and to tell a person with disability how they should refer to themselves, because both are legitimate and both come out of a movement that is really centered on people with disabilities and how people with disabilities have fought for the right to identify and define themselves and define their place in society. So let's take another moment to reflect on the information I just shared. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for how you have really understood and come to understand disability? What model of disability are you most familiar with? And how has this information that I've shared with you may have shifted your perception of disability and how it's defined? Take about a minute or so to reflect on that information. Okay. It brings us now to the 2000s and a call for disability justice. In other words, the fight to be treated justly in a manner that's equitable and fair. So the disability justice movement comes out of some critiques of the disability rights movement. And it's really the justice movement is being afforded by contemporary disability activists. So in 2005, disabled activists of color, Patty Byrne, Mia Meekness, and Stacey Mulburn really launched a framework which they entitled Disability Justice. And their intent was really to expand on the disability rights movement, which gained the rights and really benefited people with disabilities significantly. But these individuals thought now it is time to move beyond that and move forward. What they argued was that the disability rights movement focused primarily on ableism, that is, focused on anti-discrimination against people with disabilities. And while that was important, what it inadvertently did was it didn't recognize the the intersecting and other systems of oppression, other discrimination that people with disabilities who have other marginalized identities face as well. And in many ways, what they termed is invisibilize the lives of people with disabilities who are also people of color or people of other marginalized identities. And so what the disability justice movement is to provide a correction for that, to make sure that we're including in our fight towards liberation, the liberation of all marginalized people, including disabled people who also intersect with other identities. There are 10 principles of the disability justice movement. One is intersectionality, meaning that no one is just one thing. So as I shared with you all, I am a disabled person, but I also am a Black person, African-American, and I'm also a woman. And so I navigate issues not only of ableism, but also issues of racism and issues of sexism. So the intersectionality perspective is what's important towards moving towards justice for all. That leadership, those who are in leadership and leading disability activism should be those who are most impacted by ableism, racism, sexism, so on and so forth. So leadership should comprise of those that are most impacted. Changing the view, the anti-capitalistic politics is referring to changing the view that one is worthy, a person is worthy or valuable to the extent to which they can contribute economically to society. That you are valuable if you are able to work, if you are able to be employed, if you're able to contribute economically to your community. And what the disability justice movement argues is that people are valuable because they exist. People are valuable because we're here, not because we're able to work and contribute economically. Contributing economically is important, but that should not be associated and conflated with one's worth and one's value. There's a commitment to cross-movement organizing so that people with disabilities are engaging with other movements towards liberation, towards justice. There's an idea of recognizing wholeness, that one is whole regardless of whether one has a disability or not, or one may be dealing with an illness or not. That again, wholeness is not equated to quote unquote what's normal, that you're whole simply because the way you show up in this human experience is showing up as a whole human being. That you engage in activism that's sustainable to you. So not everyone is able to get out and protest in the streets. And not everyone is able to climb the Capitol stairs or lay down in front of buses. That some people have to demonstrate their activism through social media or through other kinds of ways that's sustainable for them. And that all ways of social activism is valuable and important. There's a commitment to cross-disability solidarity. Many of you who may be a part of the disability community may be aware that there's often this sort of hierarchy in disability, that those with physical disabilities are somehow more worthy than people with intellectual disabilities. And what disability justice movement says is that there's a rejection of that regardless of what disability you have, whether it's intellectual disability, whether it's an emotional disability, whether it's a mental illness, whether it's a physical disability, whether it's a neurodivergence, regardless of what it is, that in order for us to achieve justice, we have to have solidarity. That there's a fight for interdependence as opposed to independence. That we all need each other, and the focus is on how we are interdependent, which leads into the next two, that the importance of collective access. It's not just access for some people, but it's access for all people. And that my liberation is intrinsically linked to your liberation. And so there's the collective liberation movement, again, across identities, across disabilities, and across marginalized communities. There are various issues that are important to the disability rights and justice movement today. And just to name a few, the fight to revive the Disability Integration Act. And this is an act that was brought to Congress in 2019, but was not brought to the floor, but was not voted on. And this is the act specifically is about the integration of home care services for people with disabilities who need care services to be provided in their home, in their community, as opposed to having to be provided in an institution or a nursing home. So people with disabilities may be aware that some home care, some insurances will not cover home care or that kind of care unless the person is in a nursing home. And what the Disability Integration Act is to make it illegal for insurances to deny people with disabilities for receiving significant care in their home. The ban of sub-minimum wage. So there is a current practice in the the ability to pay people with intellectual disabilities below minimum wage. It's not illegal to pay people with intellectual disabilities in some work situations below minimum wage. There's an advocacy and protest against that, and to ban sub-minimum wage for all people, including people with intellectual disabilities. The fight to require nationwide mandatory training for all law enforcement dealing with people with disabilities, dealing with disabled people. When I learned this statistic, it really bothered my mind, but over 50% of instances of excessive force used by law enforcement is against people with disabilities. And so the movement to require training so that we can minimize the use of excessive force by law enforcement against people with disabilities. And that percentage goes up if you look at people with disabilities who are also racialized minorities. And then a pledge to appoint more disabled people in top administrative positions. Again, the notion of agency, the notion of representation, and the ability to access upper level posts. Disability history is Black history. Disability history is women's history. Disability history is Latino and Hispanic heritage history. Disability history is LGBTQ plus history. Disability history is, in fact, US history. Thank you all very much for joining me again on this second segment of the webinar. And I will ask you to close with a reflection on these two questions. How might learning about the history of people with disability affect the perspective students with disabilities have about themselves? So again, how might learning about the history of people with disability affect the perspective students with disabilities have about themselves? And how might learning about the history of people with disability affect the perspective of non-disabled students have about people with disabilities? So with those two questions, I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Skelton, for sharing all this amazing content, the history behind this, and the power of this movement. It has certainly opened our eyes. We are learning. And I'm excited its influence that it's going to have on our learning spaces throughout the state of Michigan. So we thank you, much applause, even though we can't hear it, but there's much applause out there for you and the work you've shared with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next webinar series is a three-part series titled Labor Rights Movement, and continues on May 10th, May 17th, and May 24th from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website and register for each date to participate in future webinars as linked in the chat box. We invite you to register if you have not yet already. If you are interested in sharing your ideas to support the future planning of the Teaching Comprehensive History Initiative, please use this link being placed in the chat box now. And/or maybe there already. We are interested in hearing your voice. Thank you all for joining us today. and the work that you do for Michigan students. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event, as well as please let us know if you need sketches through the form. Have a great rest of your day. Our team's going to hang out while all of you grab your chat or your links through the chat box for a few minutes. So please grab anything you need from the chat box before we exit the webinar. Thank you all for attending. Attendees, one more minute to grab any final content that you might need before we close the webinar out. So a little less than a minute to grab any final links. Thank you.